Shadows are calling, the curtain is drawn. How far we have fallen, I'm out on the run. Live in the violence, die by the sword. Deep in the fire, that's where darkness is born.
Hello, friends. Welcome back. I hope you're all doing well. Last time, I shared the heartbreaking story of Lionel Desmond, a combat veteran whose untreated mental health struggles, compounded by massive systemic failures, led to unimaginable tragedy. It was raw, painful, and a haunting reminder of the urgent need for reform. Today's episode takes us down a very different path. This is not a story of untreated mental illness. It's a story of entitlement. A man who, like so many perpetrators, believed he owned his partner. When she wanted to leave, he decided she didn't have the right. He couldn't tolerate her independence. He couldn't handle losing control. And so he took her life. He orphaned his own children. He shattered a family and stole a future that wasn't his to take. And I want to sit with that for a minute. What is it about these killers, most often men, sometimes women, who believe their spouse's choice to leave is a death sentence? And I'm not talking about the calculated, premeditated murders driven by financial motives and life insurance and custody battles. That's a different breed. This is about rage, about obsession, about control, about the deep, dangerous belief that no one gets to walk away from them. So let's confront this mindset, this entitlement, this violence. Let's try to understand what drives someone to such brutality when love turns to ownership and freedom threatens their ego. It feels like nearly every day there's another headline about a woman murdered by a man who refused to let her leave. And we know that this is the most dangerous time in a woman's life when she's in a coercively controlling relationship and she's trying to leave. She's had enough of the control, the abuse, the fear, and many times of the cheating and lies. So she tries to reclaim her life, and the man kills her. Why does this mindset exist? That twisted logic, if I can't have you, no one can. I've always believed it's rooted in power and control, and the belief that a partner is something you own, not someone you love. For abusers, autonomy becomes betrayal. Leaving isn't just a breakup. It's an unforgivable act of defiance against the fragile ego they've built their identity around. Most people with basic emotional logic would say, if they don't want to be with me, then I'll walk away too. Why waste the energy? But to feel that way, I think you have to know your worth. You have to believe you deserve love freely given, not coerced or trapped or tricking someone to be with you. And that's what I've been trying to understand. Why would anyone want to be with someone who doesn't want them? And worse, how does that rejection then morph into homicide? So I've started digging into the psychology behind it. Some studies explore how narcissism, abandonment anxiety, and entitlement factor into this violent possessiveness. And while no research can ever justify the violence, it can help us understand how deeply broken someone has to be to equate love with dominance. Because at its core, this isn't about love. It's about erasure. It's about saying, if you dare to exist without me, I'll make sure you don't exist at all. Psychologists across the globe have extensively studied the root causes of intimate partner violence, especially in cases where one partner kills the other during or after an attempt to leave. And research consistently shows that this type of violence is deeply rooted in power, control, and gendered entitlement. Like I said, it's usually men killing women. According to the World Health Organization, the WHO, nearly 1 in 3 women worldwide experienced physical or sexual violence, most often at the hands of an intimate partner. Studies published in the International Journal of Indian Psychology highlight that perpetrators often view their partners as possessions, and the act of leaving is perceived as a profound betrayal that threatens their identity and dominance. Psychological theories such as resource theory and that's a hard word to say, patriarchal norms suggest that when abusers feel a loss of control, especially in relationships where they perceive themselves as being replaced or abandoned, they may resort to violence as a way to reassert their power. And then, of course, substance abuse, mental health disorders, I'm sure, like PTSD. When you add the military in this, that's a whole other layer. And exposure to violence in their childhood further compound this risk. And like I said earlier, ultimately, that mindset of if I can't have you, no one can reflects a lethal intersection of entitlement, emotional instability, and systemic failures to intervene before escalation. Now, one thing that continues to shock me, and I don't know why I'd expect to grow used to it, but it's the verbal abuse I get every time I talk about domestic violence online. Pretty relentless. I've backed off social media over the past few months, quite a bit of it. If you happen to follow me, I've just not posted very much, partly for my mental health and partly because I've had a lot happening professionally, but still, that toxicity takes a toll because whenever I raise the issue, I get the same tired comments. Men insist the women cheated and deserved it, which is almost never true. Like the theme I usually see is that men cheated and got caught, and then they lash out and kill the woman for it, which is diabolical. But women can be just as misogynistic. It's horrifying. I read their comments and I think like, damn, the misogyny is coming from inside the house. But there's a difference. The comments from women usually feel rooted in ignorance. They always ask why she didn't just leave. They blame her for not leaving. She should have left. Just do whatever you have to do and leave. And yet, here we are again, repeating what advocates have said 1,000 times. The most dangerous time in a woman's life is when she tries to leave her abuser. Back to the point, not just strangers online. I truly believe a large portion of our judicial system operates from that same lens. Because when a woman is murdered and the punishment handed down is 10 to 15 years with parole, what message are we sending? Like her life was worthless? Look at Ashley Henning. Her husband murdered her on camera, and gruesomely, for that matter. The jury all watched it. He ultimately reloaded his gun and executed her, and he was sentenced to 20 fucking years. And it's not just in America. I read a case today about a young mother in Australia named Mackenzie Anderson. She was just 21 years old, right? And she's beaten and stalked and nearly killed by her ex. She survives, and he gets 8 months for that, right? 8 months. And then they let him out despite pleading and begging from Mackenzie and her loved ones to not let him out. They let him out. And what does he do? He murders her right away. And then he was given 15 years. Her kids are orphans. Her loved ones will never recover from this loss. And he might be out in time to start a new family in a few years. What kind of justice is that? How is Mackenzie's life valued so little? The world makes it painfully clear. It hates women. This is a global pattern. And yes, I usually rail against the systemic issues in the military, but the truth is, our judicial system and systems worldwide are equally culpable. I'm currently working on an episode about the murder of Crystal Mitchell, a case that's as outrageous as it is tragic. Crystal was killed by a former Marine named Ronald McLeod, a man who had previously attempted to murder his ex-wife. The only reason the ex-wife survived his strangulation was because bystanders intervened and physically pulled him off. And yet, despite that, he was granted bond. Just a few months later, while he was on bond, he murdered Crystal. He never should have been out and given the ability to prey upon Crystal. And that story is shocking. It's heartbreakingly shocking, but it's not rare. Honestly, I could spend the entire next hour just naming women who pleaded with police, judges, and the entire justice system to protect them from dangerous men. And for reasons that defy logic and humanity, the system didn't listen. It ignored documented histories of violence, it dismissed clear signs of danger, and then handed these men the keys: bond, parole, freedom, allowing them to return to the very women they once tried to destroy. And when those women are murdered, the response is always the same. Just a collective shrug and a hollow, like, we wish there was something we could have done. How terrible. By like all the people who literally could have done something. And it follows a devastatingly predictable pattern. Men commit violent acts. The system minimizes the threat. And then these men kill the women who were simply trying to survive them. And over again, the courts gamble with women's lives, and nearly every time the woman pays in blood. And it never ends. Today's case is no less maddening than the others. A man who mistreated his wife and couldn't accept that she was finally moving on decided that her freedom was unforgivable. So he stalked her, he hunted her down, and he murdered her. And does he face her family to take responsibility for what he's done? Of course not. That would require accountability. That would be redemptive in some small, tiny way. Instead, he offers a defense so absurd, so disconnected from the devastation he's caused, it just borders on delusion. But I'll let you be the judge of that. The case I bring you today is about yet another dual military couple. The challenge of military marriage is already off the charts. But dual military marriage, where one parent, where kids are involved, where one parent is solo parenting while the other is deployed to a war zone, and then they swap, that's a level of endurance that defies imagination. Hats off to anyone navigating this. If you're trying to survive this lifestyle, bless you. It must be unimaginably hard to be away from your babies and your spouse, assuming you have a healthy, not abusive spouse, and then to return and solo parent under immense stress. But God, if you don't have a healthy spouse and you're deployed and have to think about your babies with them, God bless America. Anyways, what's devastating is the pattern we're seeing in recent cases of domestic violence and even murder. So many of them involve dual military couples. And the irony is never lost on me. These women survive war zones. They leave their children behind. They worry every day about what will happen to their kids if they're killed in combat. And then they come home, having survived IEDs and hostile fire, only to be murdered by the one person who was supposed to protect them. It just devastates me. And for the families, those parents who spend sleepless nights praying their child makes it home from a combat zone, imagine the heartbreak of thinking like, thank God my baby is back on American soil, only to lose them to domestic violence. And sometimes the person that they had welcomed into the family with open arms becomes the one who takes their child's life. And this isn't just about individual tragedy, it's about systemic failure. Because the military will often treat each member of a dual military couple as an independent entity, even though their lives are so deeply intertwined. And the result means gaps in support, childcare, mental health care, and prevention. And when those gaps widen, families fall through them. Let me talk about numbers for a quick minute because I always like to back my claims with facts. According to the Department of Defense, there were over 30,000 reported incidences of domestic violence involving military personnel in 2020 alone. But as I recently shared in a previous episode, we know this number is grossly deflated. The DoD has faced ongoing criticism for failing to provide transparent and consistent data on domestic violence within the ranks. And one of the most troubling gaps is how information fails to move from base to base and across military healthcare systems, so cases aren't properly tracked. Patterns aren't connected, which means we see like those 30,000 reports in a single year as just being the surface, an already staggering number that's likely just a fraction of the true scope. That much is already too much, and knowing it's drastically undercounted is just indefensible. Now, a RAND study found that intimate partner violence rose by 177% in the Army between 2003 and 2010, even as rates declined among civilians. Again, an undercounted number. Women in dual military marriages report lower marital quality due to military stress and are more vulnerable to relationship breakdowns. That seems like a no-brainer. You're taking on so much. Combat veterans with PTSD are 3 times more likely to abuse their partner, and 91% report psychological aggression within the last year. So let's talk about this dual military couple. Amy Colbert and Lance Colbert, aged 27 and 29. Both Amy and Lance were active duty in the Army at the time of Amy's murder. And I also want to mention that Amy was a woman of color. And heartbreakingly, I couldn't find a single podcast that's covered her case, just a handful of articles, very few people talking about her. And I really try hard to focus on the cases that aren't getting the media coverage they deserve. And I always look to see if other podcasts have covered stories, and I try to avoid ones that have been covered a lot. Because the truth is, it's almost always women of color who aren't getting the attention. And of all the stories I've shared here, I think only two have centered white women intentionally, because typically white women their cases will get picked up by national news outlets. But for whatever reason, the same can't be said for women of color. And this just isn't anecdotal, it's systemic. Studies show that missing Black and Indigenous women receive 27 times less media coverage than their white counterparts. And within the military, women of color face compounded risks, racism, isolation, and a lack of culturally informed care that all intersect with the threat of domestic violence. So I tell these stories here. I tell them because they matter, because these women deserve to be remembered, to be fought for, and to be named. Now, I spent hours tracing Amy's digital footprints, scrolling through her posts from years ago, her photos, her words, trying to understand who she was beyond what happened to her. And above all, Amy was a mother to two young daughters who were the center of her world. She had her first daughter in 2015 and a second daughter in 2017. Her social media read like a love letter to her little girls. Throughout her social media posts were sweet pictures of these girls, and there was always a caption that referred to them like as her reason or her world. If she was deployed, it was how much she missed her babies. It was really emotionally rough to look at because she had so many photos that included Lance and their daughters doing cute family things, Halloween, costumes, on the beach, all those things. And it was just a true reminder that we can never really know what is happening behind the lens. But Amy loved her girls fiercely, more than anything, and she was, above all else, a devoted mother. Her two daughters were her world, and that love echoed through everything she shared online. Amy was also close to her two brothers and deeply connected to her family, a web of loyalty and support that framed the woman she was. Amy's passion for fitness was unmistakable. She posted regularly about her workouts, pushing herself physically, celebrating movement and strength. And just scrolling through her old posts felt like stepping into a time machine. It was back to 2012 Facebook where like subtlety went to die. Remember those status updates? Everyone would automatically start with your name for some reason, like no like verbs. It would be like Tressa is hot yoga, or it would be like someone's major cry for help. They would just post shit like, I swear if you were dead or alive, I wouldn't care. That was it. No punctuation, no explanation, just pure teenage angst, or in my case, 20-something angst for all 300 mutuals to witness and to try to decode while eating cereal. We didn't try to sound chill back then. There was no chill. But Amy's were different. Her posts were charming. She gave little updates on her military career, her workouts, her mood. It was wholesome and energized. You could feel her drive and her joy, her commitment to becoming stronger, not just physically, but emotionally. There was no performance, just her presence, and she came across as fierce and centered, even in the tiny slices of her life that she chose to share. She was a woman who knew who she was and didn't perform for anyone else. The kind of woman who takes no shit but does no harm. Strong, principled, unapologetically herself. And quotes pinned on Amy's Facebook page said everything to me. One from Ayn Rand said, "The question isn't who is going to let me, it's who is going to stop me." That line seemed to fit her perfectly. She was a determined girl who became a determined woman, driven, motivated, and unwilling to let anyone stand in her way. And the second quote she had pinned read, "Have goals so big you feel uncomfortable telling small-minded people." Amy didn't shrink herself. She lived boldly, fearlessly, and with her eyes fixed on something bigger. Now, Amy Contreras, and I'm choosing to use her maiden name because that's how her parents chose to have her obituary. She was born in February of 1992 in Winnemucca, Nevada, a place I have driven through many times when driving from Oregon to, I think, Colorado probably, but Winnemucca brings back memories. So she graduated from Lowry High School in 2010 and enlisted in the U.S. Army the next year. Her military career was marked by dedication and resilience. She completed 2 deployments, first a combat deployment to Afghanistan in 2012 to 2013, and later she went to Kuwait in 2018 and 2019. At the time of her death, she was serving as a chemical equipment repairer, though she had also worked as a heavy vehicle operator during her service. And Amy was assigned to the 504th Quartermaster Company, which is part of the 142nd Combat Sustainment Support Battalion under the 1st Armored Division Sustainment Brigade at Fort Bliss, Texas. She had just returned from that second deployment on March 31st, 2019, a week before her death. Amy's husband, Lance Colbert, enlisted in the Army back in August of 2012. He also served as a heavy vehicle driver. He was with the 377th Transportation Company, part of the 142nd Combat Sustainment Support Battalion under the 1st Armored Division Sustainment Brigade. Lance deployed to Afghanistan twice, once in 2013 and again in 2014, and I could find very little information about what his deployments were like. There was no mention of PTSD or traumatic brain injuries or anything like that in any of the court martials or documents I read. So Lance and Amy married in 2016, but according to those close to Amy, the relationship was troubled from early on. And the concern wasn't about mutual struggles. It was Lance's treatment of her that raised alarms. His infidelity and his possessive, controlling behavior cast a long shadow over their marriage. And while Amy remained loyal and committed, Lance seemed determined to have his cake and eat it too, wanting the stability of marriage while suffocating her with control. She wasn't the one betraying their vows, but she was one paying the emotional price. Having spent a good amount of time around the military lifestyle, I've seen this pattern play out more times than I can count. Young guys enlist and almost immediately rush into marriage, and there are reasons, some practical, some emotional. They want someone waiting for them during deployments. They want the freedom that comes with living off base, and let's be honest, they want those extra paycheck incentives and benefits that come with a spouse on paper. But then reality hits. Marriage isn't just another checkbox or bonus, it's hard. And when cracks start to show, some people double down. They have children quickly, hoping a baby might anchor the relationship, solidify it. But it is not a fix. It's a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. And then comes the first duty station. And it's less a military post and more like a meat market for impulse. Local businesses know exactly what they're doing. Bars, strip clubs, payday loan joints, and every flavor of indulgence lined up like a buffet for the barely initiated. You take one look at the scene, the crowd, the chaos, and you'd think a busload of Amish teens had just landed for Rumspringa, armed with back pay and poor judgment. It's ironic, really. The institution drills discipline into them, uniforms pressed, orders barked, honor instilled. But the surrounding ecosystem is chaos. The very culture that trains restraint simultaneously fosters excess. It's a setup, not in the conspiratorial sense, but like in the structural one. You're giving a kid a playbook of self-control, and then you're dropping him off into a playground of debauchery. And then we act surprised when he fumbles. Now, Amy and Lance spent time stationed in Hawaii, which if you're a regular listener, you already know, sets me off. I've ranted plenty about the brutality women face there and the lack of resources and support for both military women and military spouses, and I stand on that. But anyways, after Hawaii, they were moved to Fort Bliss, Texas. Fort Bliss. I mean, if that's not a misnomer, I don't know what is. Now, as I previously mentioned, Amy deployed twice during her service, once to Afghanistan and once to Kuwait. And on that second deployment in Kuwait, which was between 2018 and 2019, while she was out doing what few dare to do, the toll at home was mounting. Amy became aware, while deployed, that Lance had been unfaithful, seemingly a pattern in their few years of marriage, and she had enough. She let him know she wanted a divorce. And let's remember, as I reported earlier, this meant at this time, Amy had a young daughter that was around 3 years old when she went to Kuwait, and another she'd just given birth to in 2017 and deployed in 2018. And as a mother, the thought of giving birth and then being sent to war is almost incomprehensible. The weight of that sacrifice, I know it's not exclusive to mothers, of course, fathers face it too. But for women, it must feel like part of your body has been left behind. And many women have endured this pain, and Amy was among them. She showed remarkable courage, she fulfilled her duties, and she carried that ache of missing her daughters every single day. But she was done with the possessiveness and lies and infidelity of Lance. And so she let him know in August of 2018 that when she got home in March from deployment, she would be moving out and pursuing a divorce. And Lance was adamant that he didn't want a divorce, which I don't know, dum-dum, maybe don't be a shitty husband, so she wouldn't have wanted one. So Amy returns from deployment on March 31st of 2019, and her friends, members of Amy's units, would come with her and help her to move her belongings out of their shared housing on April 5th of 2019, and they would move her to a local hotel room. And it was the very next day that Lance Colbert would ask a subordinate if he could borrow his minivan. Now, this subordinate's full name was redacted. I'm using court-martial records for a lot of this information. And a lot of the names of service members were redacted, and only his initials were solely given. So I'm just going to call this subordinate Private First Class JW. So Lance would borrow his minivan. Lance would then drive his own personal vehicle to a sporting goods store to purchase a 13-inch tactical fixed blade hunting knife and a pair of binoculars. And goddamn, I looked up a 13-inch knife for a size reference in my mind. Chilling. So with his newly acquired gear, Lance switched to Private First Class JW's minivan, and he parked outside Amy's hotel room to surveil her. In the early evening hours of April 6th, Amy left her room to attend a homecoming celebration for her unit at an on-base residence. Lance followed her in the minivan. He parked nearby, and he used his newly purchased binoculars to spy on the house, trying to catch glimpses of Amy. At some point, he texted a friend explaining he'd borrowed JW's minivan so he could follow Amy, quote, so she won't see me. But Lance's situational awareness was lacking. Either Amy herself or another soldier noticed the minivan lingering nearby, and during the party, Amy texted a friend saying Lance was, quote, stalking her. Around 10:15 p.m., Lance made a stop at a nearby 7-Eleven to grab a beer and a cigar. And that detail may seem minor, but it becomes a key part of his eventual defense. Just minutes later, Lance was back in the neighborhood in JW's minivan watching Amy from a distance. As he drove past the house party, likely double-fisting both the beer and the binos, Lance struck a parked car on the street because apparently even stalking has a learning curve. So he drove a short distance away, a hit and run. He abandoned the minivan and fled on foot. And then he sent a text to Private First Class JW that said, I'm sorry, man. That's it. JW replied asking, like, what do you mean? And Lance answered, quote, Iraq, and I'm about to kill my wife. Now, alarmed, obviously, JW immediately calls Lance, and Lance picks up the phone. I won't pick up my phone for anything, but this guy picks up the phone, and he doubles down and says, I'm going to kill my wife. And he confirmed he had a knife. At this same moment, Amy was leaving the party with a fellow unit member, identified in court-martial documents only as Sergeant S.A. Outside the house stood a captain, also mentioned in the records as Captain C.L., but I'm going to name him because what he did was heroic, and his name is out there now. So his name is Captain Christopher Long. Captain Long had been trying to locate the minivan's driver to address the hit and run, and that's when Lance came sprinting towards the house. Long stopped him and asked what was going on, and Lance claimed he'd been out for a jog, which Captain Long said in court that he found this odd because Lance was wearing a pair of unlaced Chuck Taylors. Then Lance spots Amy as she's going to get into the passenger side of Sergeant S.A.'s sedan, and he bolts toward the vehicle. Now I'm about to give the details of Amy's murder because Lance will attempt later to feign a lack of culpability, and I believe it's important to understand exactly what he did to her. So if you'd prefer to skip these details, please fast forward about 60 seconds. Okay, so Amy's getting into the passenger seat of Sergeant S.A. sedan, and Lance is bolting towards the vehicle. Now, Christopher Long, Captain Long, didn't know the full story yet, but he immediately recognized the threat, and he gave chase. And tragically, Lance reaches the car first, and he flings open the passenger door, and he begins stabbing Amy in a rapid punching motion over and over again. Lance stabbed Amy 10 times, and he was calling her a bitch as he did it, as he plunged the knife into her over and over again. And it was only then that Captain Christopher Long managed to pull him off and subdue him, and Lance immediately confesses to Christopher, "I stabbed my wife. She caught me cheating, and she wants a divorce." Sergeant Essay, who was behind the wheel of the car, he acts heroically as well. There were multiple bystanders that night who witnessed pieces of this horrifying event, but I want to emphasize how chaotic and confusing this moment was. Between the earlier hit and run and then Lance jogging or sprinting through, no one had the context of what was happening, so I don't believe we can fault anyone for not intervening sooner. I think Captain Long, he responded with incredible speed, but trying to get Lance off of her in that moment, I think he acted as quickly as he could. It said he acted very decisively. Now, after the attack, Sergeant Essay quickly drives Amy to the ER, and while Christopher Long alerts the hospital in advance to prepare for her arrival, when they reach the hospital, Amy's curled up in the fetal position on the floor of the passenger seat, and her blood is pooled beneath her, and she has no pulse. Medical personnel works tirelessly to revive her, but within just 1 hour, Amy was pronounced dead. Later reports would reveal the extent of Lance's violence. His multiple stab wounds had lacerated both her liver and her lungs. Now, back at the house party, paramedics and military police arrive, and both noted that Lance did not appear intoxicated. He seemed hostile, volatile, and focused on harming himself. Coward. When questioned, Lance told a paramedic that Amy had caught him cheating and pissed him off. He again refused to take any accountability for his actions. So Lance is then taken to the emergency room. I don't think he's hurt. I think this is just proper procedure. But intake records list his chief complaints as depression, suicidal ideation, homicidal thoughts, substance abuse, and violent behavior. And he speaks with an ER physician whom we'll refer to as Dr. Beebe. And now this doctor becomes significant at trial, but Dr. Beebe. Lance told Dr. Beebe that after drinking alcohol and smoking marijuana with someone named Cowboy at a nearby 7-Eleven, he returned to the party and saw Amy talking to another soldier, and that, according to him, triggered his rage. He claimed he jumped from the vehicle and stabbed her. And now this part is crucial. Dr. Beebe orders 2 separate blood tests, one requested by Lance's command to determine his blood alcohol level, the other ordered by Dr. Beebe screened for alcohol, drug content, and other routine medical indicators. And those tests came back negative for marijuana and for a wide panel of substances, including barbiturates, opioids, amphetamines, and cocaine. Amy was just 27 years old when she died. She left behind 2 little girls who adored her and 2 brothers and parents who loved her fiercely. And Lance, for his part, does he step into that courtroom with humility? Does he face her family, look them in the eyes, and beg for forgiveness? Does he offer an apology? Does he vow to spend every waking moment behind bars becoming a better man, trying, however futile, to honor the life he stole? Does he take any accountability at all? Not a chance. The silence in that courtroom may have been louder than any apology. Amy Contreras was murdered on April 6th of 2019. Amy was posthumously promoted to staff sergeant following her death. At the time of her murder, she held the rank of sergeant, and the promotion was a formal recognition of her service and sacrifice. Now, just 5 days later, Lance Colbert was formally charged under the Uniform Code of Military Justice with murder, communicating threats, stalking, and indecent language. He was placed in military custody pending trial. Now, starting in October of that year, a series of pretrial hearings unfolded at Fort Bliss. Lance never formally entered a plea of not guilty, but his defense team explored every possible angle: intoxication as an excuse, diminished capacity, anything that could soften the sharp edges of a brutal and deliberate act that it was. But toxicology reports showed no drugs in his system. Still, defense insisted the sample should have been sent to a facility equipped to detect synthetic substances like flocka, bath salts. Ah, yes, the classic bath salts made me do it defense, as if delusion could excuse cruelty. So in April of 2020, Colbert, you know what? This is full disclosure. This is spelled Colbert, but I always hear Stephen Colbert show being called the Colbert Show. So I'm pronouncing it like that, but I could be wrong. In April of 2020, Colbert entered a guilty plea to unpremeditated murder as part of a plea agreement. And look, I don't understand how someone can buy a hunting knife and tell a fellow soldier he's going to kill his wife, yet walk away without a premeditated charge, but that's what happened. He signed a stipulation of fact disavowing the influence of any drugs outside of alcohol. He said it was only on alcohol, nothing else, despite earlier attempts to suggest otherwise. In the transcripts, he's asked very clearly under oath if anything else could have altered his behavior, and he says no, just alcohol. From there, the defense shifts focus. Instead of contesting the charges, they lean into remorse and rehabilitation. They knew he's going to get guilty, right? So they're trying to say, like, hey, he can be rehabilitated. Let's short sentence. Let's get him out there. They call a few character witnesses, his mom, his dad, and his stepmother. And their statements aim to humanize Lance, describing his upbringing, his military service, his role in the family. They emphasized his regret and potential for rehabilitation. And defense counsel showed Lance's support of fellow soldiers, describing how he bent over backwards to help them. They painted a picture of just an emotional unraveling of someone depressed, suicidal, broken, not calculated. But importantly, the defense kept their witness list small. Why? Well, to avoid giving the prosecution more opportunities to remind everyone of the crime's brutality. And ultimately, Lance's plea resulted in 40 years confinement and a dishonorable discharge from the military. But just months later, he seemed to have some buyer's remorse on that guilty plea because in September, Lance filed an appeal alleging ineffective assistance of counsel, failure to investigate, and missing toxicological evidence. It's hard to say, toxicological evidence. But then in January of 2022, the government fired back. Their response methodically dismantled his claims point by point. They said defense counsel was not ineffective. Their strategic choices were reasonable given the circumstances. They said no lab results supported drug use beyond alcohol. Anything missing was likely destroyed through routine procedures. Nothing suspect. Lance was thoroughly briefed on the plea deal, they added, including the possibility of life without parole, and he signed a stipulation that directly undermined his new drug-related defense. So in the end, the court found no grounds to overturn the conviction. His 40-year sentence remains. Now, Captain Christopher Long, who responded to Amy's emergency call, was awarded the Soldier's Medal, the highest honor for valor in a non-combat situation. He also would testify for the prosecution, and he endured personal attacks from the defense to the point that the judge had to step in and remind everyone that Long wasn't the one on trial. But, they say some people run towards danger, and to those people, we owe them everything. Today, Lance Colbert is serving his sentence at the United States Disciplinary Barracks in Fort Leavenworth, the military's only maximum security prison. It's where service members convicted of the most serious offenses are held, and it's where he belongs. And Amy's 2 young daughters, they're now being raised by her parents. And that's another heartbreaking fact, because grandparents should get to be just that, doting, playful, present in the ways only they can be. Instead, Amy's parents are faced with the unimaginable grief of losing their daughter while also having to step into the role that she should still hold. And they didn't ask to be heroes, but they became them. Now, I've seen some tributes that Amy's brother shared. He shared some photos and reflections about how much of Amy he sees in them. They're beautiful, bittersweet, and just a reminder that her light still flickers in the smiles of her children, even as the loss looms large. And while Amy's daughters grow up without their mother or father, Lance Colbert will live out the next 4 decades confined to one of the military's toughest prisons. But justice for Amy was never just a sentence, it's a demand for answers. How many tragedies like hers are buried in the quiet corners of base housing, dismissed as isolated events, or never making the headlines, never investigated? How many more women have to die before we confront the cracks in a system that fails to protect them from unstable servicemen unraveling post deployment, from those who probably never should have worn a uniform, and from a military healthcare system too broken to catch these men before they implode? Justice isn't just accountability, it's the courage to ask why and the conviction to change what we find. Thank you for listening today. If you're a service member struggling with mental health, please call 988, then press 1. You can also text 838-255, or you can go to veterancrisisline.net to chat. Now, if you're facing domestic violence, please don't wait. You don't owe your abuser closure. You don't owe them one last talk. You owe yourself safety. You owe yourself a future. If you have to even ask yourself whether you should leave for your safety, the answer is yes. And no matter where you are in the world, help exists. Now, please check the show notes for helplines and shelter directories. I'm including international support in my show notes now, since there are now a lot of international listeners. So please stay safe.